The boy leaned against the wall beside the janitor's closet, where the flickering neon light cut across the dusty, frosted glass. His old rubber boots were smeared with dried mud, his faded flannel shirt torn slightly at the shoulder, and on his face there was a silence far too heavy for someone only 13 years old. Behind that glass door was a world he had never been allowed to touch. Emerson Robotics, the leading automation plant in the Rust Belt, was dying. The $6 million production line had been shut down for 2 weeks. Dozens of local engineers and experts from Japan, Germany, and Israel had been flown in. They examined every circuit, analyzed every line of code, dismantled every module, but nothing worked. The machine, once hailed as the future of smart manufacturing, now lay lifeless, like a steel beast with no breath. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew if a fix wasn't found soon, hundreds of workers would lose their jobs, and the entire small town, which depended on Emerson, would crumble with it. That morning, the roar of a Gulfstream G650 engine tore through the concrete courtyard. A man stepped out. Tailored grey suit, thin lead-colored silk tie, polished Italian leather shoes. His face was expressionless, cold, without a trace of a smile. That was Preston Hayes, the new CEO, sent by the corporation to clean house. Among the engineers, he was known as the blade that never dulls. Just one look, one 5-minute meeting, and an entire department could be gone. Preston had no tolerance for inefficiency, no patience for delays, and no belief in things like emotions or loyalty. As he walked into the factory, he glanced briefly at the blue-uniformed workers, and that single glance was enough to drop the room's temperature several degrees. In the center of the control room, Preston sat down, his fingers tapping lightly on the metal table. His voice rang out evenly, low, but sharp as a scalpel. $6 million, 2 weeks, and you still can't get one machine to start. No one answered. Preston looked around, then sneered, eyes drifting toward the hallway. If you can't fix it, maybe we should let the people who mop the floors have a try. A wave of laughter erupted, awkward at first, then spreading. Someone even glanced toward the hallway where Malik Evans was still standing, clutching his backpack, eyes unblinking. No one knew who he was. They assumed he was just the janitor's kid, a silent, nameless shadow. But in that moment, between the laughter and the mocking stares, something shifted. In Malik's deep brown eyes, something stirred. Not anger, but a quiet challenge. And no one, not even Preston Hayes, had the slightest idea that this very boy would be the one to make Emerson Robotics and the society around it look at itself all over again. The air inside Emerson Robotics was thick, like even the concrete walls were bearing the weight of invisible fear. The smell of machine oil mixed with cold metal clung to every thread of clothing, every strand of hair, a scent of failure no one dared to name. Down the long hallway leading to the production floor, hurried footsteps passed Malik as if he were invisible. People were busy or pretending to be avoiding eye contact, avoiding even the truth that breathed right among them. The line had stopped, and the future was frozen. Malik sat quietly on a wobbly wooden stool, the one his uncle, James Evans used to rest between mopping shifts. Beside him was the old janitorial cart, neatly stacked with bottles of cleaner. He looked like just another piece of cleaning equipment, not a person sitting in the very brain of the factory. But his eyes told another story. Malik didn't look down. He watched every movement, every mumbled curse from the engineers, every time a computer was rebooted over and over. And above all, he took noted the invisible distances people kept from one another, just because of skin color, just because of being labeled farm boy's kid. The control room door swung open. Preston walked out, a smirk on his face, followed by department heads, engineers, and foreign experts in crisp white shirts and gleaming shoes. They walked as if the floor wasn't clean enough for their souls. One of the white engineers, salt and pepper hair, brushed past Malik, glanced at his mud-caked boots, and muttered, "Farm boys should stay in the fields." The man beside him scoffed, "Or with a mop. That's where they belong." Malik heard every word. But he didn't turn his head. He just tightened his grip on the backpack strap and straightened his back a little more. At the end of the hallway, Uncle James was pushing the cleaning cart closer, worry in his eyes. He'd worked there for over 20 years, long enough to know this place divided people not by skill, but by skin color and uniform. He called out softly, "Malik, let's go, son. You don't have to take this." Malik turned to him, his voice low and calm. "If I leave, then what they said will always be true." James couldn't reply. His throat tightened. He knew his nephew was stubborn, just like his father had been. Farther down. Preston glanced at Malik once more. No one could say why the CEO kept looking at the boy. Maybe it was just to make sure the little shadow knew his place. Or maybe, just maybe, he sensed something unspoken beginning to rise in the silence of that flannel-shirted kid. And even when everyone turned away, Malik stayed right there, unmoving, unafraid. Not because he was used to being judged, but because he had made a decision. Today's silence would not repeat itself again. Inside the control room, the clatter of keyboards echoed, fans whirred loudly, and a sound beyond naming filled the air. The kind of tension that lasts so long people begin to surrender. A German engineer was presenting a fault diagram on the screen. Preston Hayes sat with his arms folded, tapping his pen coldly on the metal table. His voice cut through the room like a blade. 12 people, 14 nights, $6 million. And you're telling me the problem is a missing signal? No one answered. Preston stood up, his gaze like a hammer pounding down on everyone in the room. Then, suddenly, he turned, pointing out toward the hallway where Malik was now accidentally caught in view through the frosted glass. A crooked smirk spread across his face, laced with mockery and calculated insult. "Why don't we let the janitor's kid have a go? Who knows, maybe he's got magic hands. We could use a little entertainment." "Right." Laughter exploded. At first, just a few chuckles. Then it spread like a small fever not born of humor, but fear. Fear of Preston. fear of siding with the black country kid. A middle-aged manager snorted mockingly. "Kid, don't blow it up. That machine's worth more than the town you're from." Malik heard every word. He stepped forward and opened the door, backpack still slung over his shoulder, face expressionless. There was no swagger, no speech, just a quiet nod. "All right, let me try." The room fell silent for a beat, then erupted like it had been hit by a surprise comedy act. "Wait, you're serious? This kid's gonna touch a $6 million system. Someone get a fire extinguisher." Phones came out. Cameras turned toward the 13-year-old boy with a torn flannel shirt, mud-covered boots, and eyes that knew no fear. Preston didn't say a word. He merely stepped back, folded his arms, and gave a subtle nod, as if commanding, "Let the kid humiliate himself." In a corner, James Evans, Malik's uncle, grabbed the handle of the mop cart for balance, staggered. He started to step forward to stop it all. But Malik shook his head. Not a word. He slid the backpack off and placed it on the ground. The sound of the zipper echoed in the silence like the opening bell of a mismatched fight. He pulled out an old screwdriver and walked toward the industrial beast lying dormant, the Emerson Robotics automated packaging line. The engineers instinctively stepped back, their eyes a mix of challenge and curiosity. Some were already live-streaming it across the company's internal channels. Others whispered bets. 5 minutes. He'll short it in 5 minutes. Malik didn't look at anyone, didn't answer a single word. He stood firm at the control panel, took one deep breath, then raised his hand steady, unrushed, and opened the circuit cover. A young engineer involuntarily stepped back, as if afraid the kid might break something. Preston raised an eyebrow, his hands clenched behind his back. And in that moment, unseen by most, a silent battle had begun, not between engineering and risk, but between a boy dismissed by the world and a system built on credentials, bloodlines, and starched suits. Malik leaned in, his small hand touching the cold metal shell. Under the harsh white light, his brown skin stood out sharply among the ring of impassive faces surrounding him. Silence, tension, and somewhere within that stillness, a quiet, hidden hope from those too afraid to show it. In Malik's mind, the sounds of the room slowly faded away, replaced by the whistle of wind through barley fields, the chug of a tractor rattling across red clay, the voice of his father, Calvin Evans, grumbling late into the night over a misaligned gear, and the scent of engine oil mixed with sun-dried hay soaked into his clothes since the first time he ever held a wrench. Every machine has a rhythm. Son, don't fix what's loud. Fix what's silent. That's what his father used to say. In the small wooden shed behind their farm, no internet, no digital schematics, but everything a boy needed to turn scrap into a breathing machine. Malik quietly removed the protective casing over the control panel. Inside were hundreds of colored wires, circuit boards densely soldered, LEDs blinking faintly like a dying heartbeat. A salt-and-pepper-haired engineer squinted and scoffed. "Kid, you sure you know what you're touching?" "This ain't your daddy's tractor." Laughter rippled again, but this time it didn't last, because Malik didn't react the way they expected. No flushed cheeks, no comeback. He simply looked up, his eyes calm, so calm it made a few people suddenly uncomfortable. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a 7-head screwdriver and a small flashlight, the same tools he'd once used to rebuild the irrigation system for an entire field after a hurricane season. Malik leaned in and pressed his ear against the panel. A young engineer burst out. What is he doing? Listening to it like it's a conch shell. But Clara Donnelly, the chief engineer standing off to the side, didn't laugh. She watched closely. Watched the way Malik moved, not searching for faults like a man reading blueprints, but like someone listening. And then Malik's grease-stained hands began to work. Each screw was removed gently. Every contact point was examined first with his eyes, then with the sensitive tips of his fingers. His movements were precise, fluid, like an old tune he had practiced again and again in the darkness of that shed. No one spoke. No one laughed. Only the soft click of the screwdriver echoed steadily, and the quiet breathing of people who were beginning to wonder what exactly they were witnessing. A young engineer still live-streamed. The camera focused, but now there were no more sarcastic comments, just the image of a boy making a $1 million control room forget how to laugh. Preston still stood with arms folded, but now his brow had furrowed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something he hadn't accounted for. Malik closed his eyes for a few seconds, took a deep breath. Behind his lids, in the darkness, he saw his father's hand, rough, calloused, but steady, resting on his shoulder when he was only 8. No one will believe you just because you're smart. They'll believe you when you're patient. And that patience, honed through years of silence, was now shining, right in the heart of the place that had once looked down on him the most. The fluorescent lights reflected off Malik's forehead, and a single bead of sweat dropped onto the circuit board like a memory falling into the present. No one moved. The expensive leather shoes that had strutted with arrogance just minutes ago now stood still. No one dared interrupt. No one knew what to say. Only the boy's hands, the hands of a janitor's kid, kept tracing each wire, each connector, each pea-sized component tucked beneath layers of metal. Malik paused at a cluster of red and green wires. He frowned. Behind him, an older engineer clicked his tongue. Backwards polarity. That'll short the whole thing on boot. A small wire cluster, positive and negative reversed, could destroy the entire system at startup. A subtle flaw, the kind even experts could easily miss. But Malik didn't. He whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear, "Who wires polarity like this?" The boy's quiet remark sliced into the confidence of every engineer who had spent 2 weeks inspecting the machine without spotting that flaw. A young technician swallowed hard. Another glanced over at Preston, waiting for direction. But Preston didn't move. He only tilted his head slightly, voice ice cold. Let him continue. Everyone's here for the show. Right. Another wave of laughter almost broke out. But this time, no one could quite manage it, because everyone could feel it now. Something was very off. Malik carefully removed the miswired cluster, reversed the polarity, and fastened it firmly. He rechecked every sensor, recalibrated the scan angle down to exactly 0.02 degrees a tweak. Only someone with hands-on intuition would dare to adjust manually. Clara Donnelly, the chief engineer, stepped closer. Her normally stern face had softened into contemplation. She had watched hundreds of young engineers handle machinery before, but few ever moved like this boy, calm, deliberate, without a single wasted motion, as if he were the one who designed the machine in the first place. "This isn't luck," she murmured. When Malik replaced the protective panel and tightened the final screw, the entire room held its breath. Some had lowered their phones. Others had already forgotten why they pulled them out in the first place. Preston remained standing rigid, expressionless, but there was doubt behind his eyes now. He knew if Malik succeeded, everything he relied on to stay in control would begin to crumble. Malik stood up and looked directly at the central control board. No boasting, no swagger. He simply raised his hand and pressed the start button. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Nothing. Preston's lip curled slightly. But just then a low hum echoed from deep inside the machine. A soft vibration. Then the LEDs blinked from red to green. The gears began to turn. A smooth mechanical rhythm, like a heartbeat, came alive. The machine roared back to life. The room erupted in collective exhales. One grizzled engineer chuckled aloud, then clapped. Another followed, then a third. And soon the entire room. It wasn't the kind of polite applause people give out of courtesy. It was the sound of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't explain with logic. Malik stepped back. His eyes never lifted high, but his gaze no one dared to meet it. From sneers to silence. From a country boy to someone who made an entire system pause and listen. The hum of the machinery grew louder, like the heartbeat of a patient revived from cardiac arrest. Warning lights shifted from red to yellow, then lit up green in succession. On the central control panel, data streams stabilized in real time. The entire $6 million packaging line, the one people claimed only a miracle could save, was now running smoothly. Right in front of dozens who had once mocked the boy in the torn flannel shirt. A single clap broke the stillness. It came from the oldest engineer in the room. Then, almost involuntarily, a second joined in. Then a third, and soon the entire room stood to their feet. A thunderous ovation rolling like a storm. Not because Malik was a genius, but because he had done what none of them with their degrees, their experience, their 6-figure salaries could do. He listened to the machine. Malik took a slow breath and stepped back. His eyes scanned the room, and for the first time, the eyes that met his were no longer full of scorn, but respect, tinged with shame. At the back of the room, James Evans, still standing beside the mop cart, covered his mouth with a trembling hand. His eyes welled up, and he wept. In all his years at the factory, he had never once seen anyone bow their head to someone like him, but today they bowed to his nephew. Preston Hayes stood motionless, like stone, his usual icy smirk gone. His face had gone pale for a moment, and his hands clenched tightly behind his back. He tried to speak, forced it out. This must be luck. Maybe the system rebooted from previous fixes. But no one answered, no one followed up, no one even turned toward him anymore. And that silence, that was what Preston feared most when people stopped fearing him. A young engineer quietly lowered his phone, awkwardly deleting the live stream he had just recorded. A manager pulled his hands from his pockets and began to step toward Malik, as if to say something, then froze, unsure whether to begin with an apology or a thank you. Clara Donnelly, who had held the position of chief engineer for over 15 years, stepped forward. She looked at Malik for a long moment, then placed a hand gently on his shoulder. You just did what our entire engineering team couldn't. You saw something we missed for 2 straight weeks. How did you know? Malik wiped the sweat from his brow and answered calmly, not like a victor, but like someone who had lived alongside machines his whole life. I learned from my dad. On the farm, every machine has its own voice. You just have to listen. The room fell silent again. But this time, it was the silence of respect. A few of the older engineers nodded slowly. Not everyone found it easy to admit, but in their eyes, something had shifted. A piece of pride had broken off. A crack had formed in the fortress called "We Know Best." From the other side of the hallway, a few black workers stood still, watching quietly. They said nothing, just smiled a small, proud smile. Because they knew that today, it wasn't just a broken machine that had been repaired. It was an entire belief system rebuilt by a pair of greasy hands and a heart that refused to bow. The final claps faded away, but the air in the room didn't return to what it once was. It carried a change not exactly comfortable, but undeniable, as if everyone was now looking at each other, and then looking inward. Malik remained where he was, wiping his hands with an oil-stained cloth. No showboating, no posing. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he had simply finished a job he knew how to do. Clara Donnelly still stood nearby. She wasn't someone easily moved, but when she spoke again, her voice had noticeably softened. "What's your name?" "Son Malik Evans," he replied calmly. Clara gave a slow nod. "Who taught you these things? Skills like that don't just come from nowhere." Malik looked up, his gaze steady. "My dad. He taught me on the farm." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. One engineer murmured, "Evans, Evans," who Clara's brows drew together, as if something had stirred in a long-forgotten corner of her memory. "What's your father's name?" Malik paused for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Calvin Evans." For a second, the entire room froze. A stunned, "What escaped from the back?" A silver-haired engineer stopped mid-step. Another blurted out, "No way." That name, Calvin Evans, was no stranger to those who'd been in the industry long enough. Not too long ago. He had been a symbol, the first black man to design an automated system for Henderson Machinery, a guest speaker at MIT, a role model for an entire generation of young engineers. And then he vanished from the field after a lab accident left his right arm nearly unusable. After that, no one mentioned him again. Preston Hayes stood rigid. His face tightened like a string suddenly snapped. His lips pressed into a line, but this time no one paid attention to him anymore. An older engineer stepped forward, his voice shaky. "You're really Calvin Evans' son?" Malik nodded. The engineer dropped into a chair, whispering almost to himself, "Dear God, the man who helped us design the conveyor network for the entire southern sector became a farmer, and this is his son." Another wave of silence passed through the room, but this time it wasn't from shock, it was from shame, because they realized they had laughed at the son of a man they once celebrated as a genius just because he wore torn clothes and brought the scent of soil into their polished factory. Malik had never bragged. He hadn't mentioned his father until someone asked, because to him, talent didn't need to ride on a name or a medal. It came with responsibility, with love for the craft, and with a patience that refused to break no matter how much the world tried to belittle it. At the back of the room, James Evans shed tears for the second time that morning, but this time they were the tears of a man once called invisible, now watching his nephew make an entire room bow their heads in reverence. And in that very moment, Preston Hayes, the man who once towered over everyone, felt his power swept away by a name he couldn't buy, couldn't bend, couldn't control anymore. The name Calvin Evans still echoed through the room, like the aftershock of a legend unexpectedly reborn. Those who had once sat beside him in high-level technical briefings, who had quoted his work in academic journals, suddenly felt like children standing before something larger than degrees and job titles a symbol. Soft murmurs rippled across the room. Calvin Evans. Didn't he improve the high-speed packaging system back in 2009? I thought he retired. No, I heard. After that accident, they pushed him out of the industry, and then the back door creaked open. A tall, lean man stepped inside, faded shirt, old jeans, a sun-worn face lined deeply not by age, but by years of wind, labor, and disappointment. But his eyes were different. They were bright, so bright as the day he once stood before an auditorium of engineers, lecturing on torque balance in extreme field conditions. Malik turned around. He wasn't surprised. He simply gave a tiny smile, the kind a son gives his father to say, "I did it." Calvin Evans walked to the center of the room. There was no music, no drums, only a silence weighted with meaning, as if every sound had stepped aside to let memory pass through. Preston Hayes stood frozen. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't move. In his eyes was the one emotion he'd spent his entire career avoiding, the feeling of standing next to someone he couldn't control. Calvin stopped beside Malik and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Then he looked around, one face at a time, not to accuse, not to prove anything. He simply spoke in a warm, steady voice that flowed like a country breeze through the heart of the factory. "Good morning. My name is Calvin Evans. These days, I'm just a farmer, but I used to live and work among machines like this." He paused, then turned toward Malik. "Today, I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here because I'm proud of my son." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Some lowered their heads. Others wiped at their eyes. A few older engineers gave slow nods as if to silently say, "You've always had our respect." Clara Donnelly stepped forward first. No long speech, no dramatics. She simply reached out and took Calvin's hand with a mixture of deep respect and quiet regret. "We missed you, Mr. Evans. Without you, this line would have never run the way it did today." Malik stood silently beside his father, but for the first time, those who had once seen him as a shadow were now seeing him as a light illuminated by the very name they had once forgotten. "And Preston Hayes." He forced a smile, struggled to step forward and extend his hand to Calvin Evans, the same hand that had waved away countless careers with a flick. Calvin took the handshake, light, not submissive, not stiff, but in his eyes there was a message. "You may hold power, but I hold the truth." And today, the truth walked in. From the moment Calvin Evans clasped hands with Preston Hayes in silence, the invisible line between outsiders and those in charge at Emerson Robotics began to crack, not loudly, but irreversibly. Malik Evans, the boy once mocked as the janitor's kid, was now immediately invited to join the plant's top engineering team. Clara Donnelly personally made the recommendation. "He doesn't just have skill. He saw what our entire engineering system overlooked. And that is something you can't train." An emergency meeting was held that very afternoon, not with Preston at the center, but with Clara and the technical managers. There, Malik presented a preliminary analysis of potential faults in the control system. No PowerPoint, no flashy language. He drew diagrams by hand on a whiteboard, explaining everything in simple terms and clear visuals. When he finished, no one clapped, but the room remained still, not from skepticism, but because everyone was rearranging the way they saw this boy and themselves. In a brief lull, Mark Benson, the manager who had once loudly mocked Malik in front of the entire factory, stood up. His voice was low, unguarded. "I used to think I was good because I'd been here a long time. Used to think I was right because I had a degree. But today, I see I was wrong." He turned to Malik and bowed his head. "I'm sorry for not seeing your real worth, and I don't deserve to teach anyone anything if I'm not willing to learn from you." No one saw it coming. It wasn't a paper apology, not a perfunctory, "I get it now." It was a true admission of fault, spoken aloud inside a system that had never accepted anyone who didn't fit the mold. From that moment, things began to change bit by bit. Engineers who used to sit away from Malik in the cafeteria now invited him to join their tables. They asked for his input on small projects, then bigger ones. The same people who had once live-streamed in hopes of watching him fail now scribbled down his every observation like eager students. Clara Donnelly, once a stickler for professional distance, became the fiercest advocate for every one of Malik's proposals. When a group of veteran engineers doubted his idea to optimize sensor speeds, Clara didn't get angry. She simply said, "If anyone in this room can fix a $6 million production line in 30 minutes like he did, I'll gladly hand over my role as chief engineer." The room fell dead silent. Calvin Evans didn't say much. He accepted a part-time advisory role at the factory, not for recognition, but because he wanted to be near his son during this historic moment. Every time Malik spoke in meetings, Calvin sat quietly in the back row, pride shining in his eyes, but never interrupting. He let Malik walk his own path, lead in his own way. And Emerson Robotics, a plant once proud of its cutting-edge technology, was now learning to take pride in its people. Beneath the old paint of hierarchy and control, a new generation was being born. They didn't carry legacy surnames. They didn't wear tailored suits. They came with greasy hands and minds that had long gone unseen. A transformation had begun. Not because Malik was trying to prove anything, but because he lived with integrity and let the truth speak for itself. What started as the lone action of a boy dismissed by everyone had become the spark that lit up an entire system once cloaked in the shadows of prejudice. Less than a week after Malik revived the production line, Emerson Robotics began changing in ways no one expected. The once quiet, stone-faced hallways now echoed with laughter and lively debates among people who never used to stand near one another. White workers, black workers, immigrants now sat side by side on the lab floor, holding the same circuit board, repairing the same sensor. The engineering departments posted a new slogan on every wall: "True innovation begins with true respect." Malik became a role model for every young engineer at the plant. He never asked for a private office, never requested a title. But every afternoon, clusters of junior engineers, interns, and even seasoned workers gathered around him asking questions, taking notes. Sometimes just listening to him analyze the subtle rattle of a loose bolt. And in the far corner of that room, Calvin Evans, the father, once cast out by an entire industry, sat on a wooden chair, quietly observing. Each time he saw his son crouch down to explain something to a young engineer, he smiled, not the smile of pride, but of a man who knew that, at last, the right thing had found its way back into the light. Even Preston Hayes, the former symbol of cold authority, couldn't deny the new wave sweeping through the factory. At first, he remained silent, simply watching. But after a few meetings where new voices dominated the conversation, he began to listen. For the first time in many years, he truly listened, in a closed-door meeting with the board of directors. Preston sat quietly for a long while before saying something no one expected to hear from him. "Maybe I was wrong, not because I'm weak, but because I was afraid to change." Outside the factory, word spread like wildfire. Technical journals published headlines like "From Dirt to Design, the farm boy who rebooted a factory and a culture. Local schools invited Malik to speak to students. During one visit, a young black girl in a worn uniform stood up and asked Mr. Malik, "If I don't have anyone to teach me and I don't have money for college, can I still be an engineer?" Malik knelt beside her and gently took her hand. "You don't need to start in the right place. You just need to not quit in the middle." From that point on, Malik and his father began hosting small workshops in rural towns, places where kids had been pushed out of the science stream simply because they didn't fit the mold. Back at the factory, no one called him the janitor's kid anymore. They called him Evans with respect, not pity. The community around Emerson Robotics began to change too. Cafes that once refused to hire black staff now started offering free STEM classes for kids. People who used to say, "There's no such thing as a black engineer," were now the ones sharing articles about Malik on social media, not because they were forced to change, but because their hearts were moved by the only thing powerful enough to move prejudice: the truth. Within weeks of the events at Emerson Robotics, the name Malik Evans had reached far beyond the factory walls, spreading across social media, headlines, and engineering forums like wildfire. Time magazine featured him on the cover with the headline, "The engineer we never saw coming." The engineer we never saw because we never wanted to look. A photograph of Malik standing beside the revived assembly line, still in his old flannel shirt, hands stained with grease, eyes calm but fiercely bright, became a new symbol of belief, resilience, and talent unbound by background. From the STEM Equity Summit in New York to the World Robotics Forum in Berlin, top conferences invited both Malik and Calvin Evans to speak. But when they arrived, they didn't wear luxury suits. They dressed just as they always did. And when Malik took the stage, he didn't speak about himself. He spoke about nights fixing tractors with his father in a rotting chicken shed. He talked about the first time he was called the janitor's kid and why he still showed up at the factory the next day. And finally, he looked directly at the thousands in the crowd and said, "I'm not here to be admired. I'm here to remind us all of one thing. Talent doesn't ask for permission. It just needs a chance." The entire hall rose to their feet, not because it was a clever line, but because it was true. On Reddit, Twitter, and TikTok, the hashtag #BeLikeMalik spread like wildfire. Thousands of stories poured in a young Latinx girl applying to an elite engineering program for the first time. A shy Asian boy once teased for his slow English, now leading his school's robotics team. And in Atlanta, a black student wrote in a letter to Malik, "I used to think I had to change my voice, the way I dressed, even how I thought, just to be accepted. But now I understand I only need to hold on to what's right and never apologize for being myself." Emerson Robotics, once a symbol of rigid tradition, was now taught as a model of cultural transformation in MBA programs, engineering courses, and human rights seminars. Other companies began to follow suit, inviting back overlooked technical advisors, and they no longer asked, "What's your degree?" They asked, "What have you built?" Even Preston Hayes, the man who once held all the power, had become little more than a name on a meeting memo. The board of directors requested his resignation from the CEO position, and when he walked out of the factory gates for the last time, no one came to see him off. But it was Preston himself, in his final meeting, who quietly admitted, "We tried to control things with power, but real value can't be controlled. It spreads on its own, just like Malik did." Malik now served as the head of technological innovation at Emerson Robotics. But titles never mattered to him as much as the ability to touch the machines every day, to talk with young engineers, and to pass on what his father once taught: don't fear big machines, don't fear loud voices, just learn how to listen. And that's exactly what he did, not just with a production line, but with an America still learning to listen to itself again. One Monday morning, sunlight poured over the faded tin rooftops of Emerson Robotics. There were no more hurried footsteps, no more fearful silences or nervous glances traded between colleagues. The air was alive, not because the machines were humming smoothly, but because people had finally begun to understand each other. Malik walked into the production floor, as he always did, still wearing his old dirt-stained boots, still carrying his father's worn technical notebook filled with handwritten notes from 10 years ago. But today, the colleagues who once looked down on him now stood waiting with different eyes. Eyes of respect, no longer guarded. At the center of the factory floor, a group of new engineers, white, black, Asian, Latinx, were deep in a lively debate over a new design. Malik walked over. No one fell silent because the boss arrived. They waved him in like a fellow traveler, because here, now, every good idea, no matter where it came from, had a seat at the table, at the far end of the plant. Calvin Evans sat on a wooden bench by the window. He watched his son, busy collaborating with the team, as quietly as the country wind that used to whistle through the old house. His face was lined with years, but his eyes shone brightly, as if every past wound had been stitched closed by today's faith. He stood up, walked over, and gently placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You didn't just fix a machine, Malik. You fixed the way people see each other." Malik squeezed his father's hand in return. His breath trembled, but not from fear, from emotion. Just like the very first day he walked into the factory in a torn flannel shirt, only this time he wasn't walking alone. At the local school, a photo of Malik now hung in the science room, a boy with grease-stained hands, smiling beside the rebooted production line. Beneath it read the caption, "It doesn't matter where you start. What matters is that you don't stop." At conferences, when someone mentioned Emerson Robotics, they no longer talked only about technology. They spoke of how a 13-year-old boy walked into a place where no one expected him and left behind something unforgettable. And to all those who once lived on the margins of society, the kids from the farms, from the projects, from rundown classrooms, Malik Evans became living proof. That difference isn't a burden. It's the foundation for building what's never been built before. One evening, during a quiet moment at the end of the day, an intern turned to Malik and asked, "What do you think made the biggest difference?" Malik looked out the window. where sunlight spilled across the arms of workers moving in rhythm with the steady hum of machines. He answered, slowly, not skill, not fame, but someone who believed. They deserved to be heard. If you've ever been underestimated because of where you're from, because of your skin color, because of things you can't change, remember this story, because sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, for the whole world to learn how to listen again. And maybe that person is you.